Before the wind died, the world felt alive in a way people no longer remember. The air had once carried everything: warmth, storms, seasons, the drifting seeds that fed villages, the tides that shaped the shores, even the quiet whisper many believed belonged to the gods. It moved through fields and forests like a living spirit, brushing against people's faces as if reminding them they were never alone. But all of that ended on a single, forgotten night. It began with a strange stillness. At first, no one noticed. Children laughed at how the tree branches no longer swayed. Farmers paused, wondering why seeds no longer scattered from their hands. Sailors stood confused on their silent boats, unsure why their sails hung limp even as the sky above them burned with bright morning light. Then the stillness deepened. Skies froze into a perfect, unsettling calm. Birds tried to take flight, beating their wings with wild effort, only to fall back to the earth, confused and frightened. Oceans became flat and heavy, like giant mirrors reflecting clouds that would never drift. Even the smallest flames struggled to move, standing straight like a frozen tear of light. People tried to reason with the silence, but nothing answered them. Not the sea, not the sky, not even the soft breath they once felt brushing their cheeks during the night. Soon, whispers began to spread, quiet at first, then heavier than thunder. The wind had died, and it had not died on its own. It was said that a woman's curse had ended it. No one knew her name. Some imagined her as a monster, others as a grieving spirit. Some said she was made of shadows. Others insisted she was once just like them, made of muscle, heart, and hope, but driven beyond breaking. What all stories agreed upon was this: she had spoken words so full of pain that the world itself listened. She had cursed the wind, and the wind had obeyed. In time, this act would become a legend told with both fear and sorrow. Many believed it was a tale of power, but those who understood the truth knew it was not power that ended the wind. It was heartbreak so deep it changed the world. This was the beginning of the tragedy that shaped everything to come. Long before she became the woman of the curse, Ilara was simply a child of the cliffs, born in a village where the wind ruled every corner of life. The village stood at the edge of a tall coastline, shaped by centuries of storms. Homes were built low to the ground, with roofs tied down by thick ropes. People learned to lean their bodies into strong gusts, the way others might lean into a hug. To grow up, there was to grow up with the wind as a constant companion. Ilara felt it before she even understood it. As a little girl, she would stand on the cliffs with her arms open, letting the air push against her small body. She liked the way it wrapped around her, wild but gentle, like a friend trying to make her laugh. The wind carried scents from faraway places, salt from the sea, smoke from cooking fires, and sometimes the sweet smell of flowers drifting from the inland forests. Her father, a fisherman, depended on the wind more than anything else. She remembered watching him push his boat into the water, the sails puffing out like the chest of a proud bird. The wind carried him across the waves and carried him home again. Every time it brought him back safely. She thanked it in her own quiet way. But her mother had a different relationship with the wind. She believed it carried messages, warnings, blessings, and sometimes voices that only the most sensitive could hear. She hung long ribbons and prayer flags outside their home. Whenever the wind moved them, she would close her eyes and listen, as if hearing a language no one else understood. Ilara admired that. She wanted to hear the wind the way her mother did. And sometimes, it felt like she almost could. But the wind was not only a friend. One stormy night, when Ilara was still young, the wind turned violent. The sky roared like an angry beast, and waves slammed against the rocks with terrible force. Her parents rushed to tie down the roof, racing against the growing storm. Ilara remembered the fear in her mother's eyes that usually held calm, steady warmth. Then the wind took her. It happened in a swift, brutal moment. A powerful gust tore through the village, ripping ropes, snapping wood, and hurling debris across the cliffs. Her mother was swept off her feet and carried toward the edge before anyone could stop it. Ilara saw her disappear into the darkness below, swallowed by the storm. After that night, the wind never felt the same. It still moved through the village, still pushed the sails, still whispered at her window. But Ilara no longer trusted it. She felt its sharp edges. She sensed danger in its sudden shifts. She believed, deep in her heart, that the wind took as easily as it gave. As she grew older, people began noticing something unusual about her. Ilara seemed to sense storms long before clouds gathered. She felt changes in the air that others overlooked. The tiniest shifts in pressure, the smallest tremble before a gale. Sometimes she would stop suddenly in the middle of a task, touching her chest as if something invisible had brushed past her. The villagers said she was wind-marked, someone touched by the same force that had taken her mother. Some feared she might attract storms. Others believed she had inherited a strange gift. Ilara didn't know which was true. All she knew was that the wind made her feel both large and small at the same time, connected to the sky, yet constantly reminded of her own fragility. She carried this contradiction into adulthood. She became strong because she had to. She learned to read the sea because the village depended on it. She learned to face storms because running from them never saved anyone. But she also carried a quiet, heavy ache in her heart, an ache shaped like the space her mother once filled. She tried to let it go. She tried to forgive the wind. But forgiveness never came easily to her. Still, something inside her waited. Something restless, something trembling, something rising like a slow, gathering storm. And though she could not know it yet, the wind was waiting too. The year Ilara turned 20 felt different from the ones before it. The wind had carried many storms to her village, but that year the air seemed calmer, almost thoughtful. The sea still shifted and sighed, but its rhythm felt gentler, as if the world was taking a slow breath after years of roaring. Ilara welcomed the change, though she didn't fully trust it. Then Kale arrived. He came with a group of travelers who followed the wind from coast to coast. They were known as wind readers, people who believed the sky spoke through shifting air patterns. They traveled lightly, carrying simple belongings and thin banners that fluttered behind them like moving lanterns. Many villagers saw them as strange wanderers, but others admired their calm presence. Ilara noticed Kale before she noticed the others. He stood tall, but something in his posture was soft and steady. His eyes were the kind that paid attention to everything: the waves, the sky, the dirt beneath his feet. He moved with quiet confidence, as if he was never in a hurry because he trusted the wind to guide him. He intrigued her immediately, though she didn't know why. Kale's group had come to study a ray shift in air currents along the cliffs. They said it was a good omen, a sign of balance. Ilara didn't believe in such hopeful things anymore, but she listened anyway. She found herself watching the way Kale lifted his face toward the breeze, as if reading invisible pages written across the sky. He reminded her of her mother in that way, open to the wind, willing to hear things others ignored. But instead of bringing pain, the memory felt strange and warm around him. Over the next weeks, Kale noticed Ilara too, not because she tried to catch his attention. She had never been someone who reached out easily, but because she carried an awareness he recognized. She paid attention to the sky the same way he did. She tensed before storms. She stepped into the wind with a cautious respect, as if she sensed more than she wanted to. Kale admired that. It drew him to her. They began spending time together, walking along the cliffs or standing silently near the sea. Their connection grew in the quiet moments, watching birds circle overhead, tracing storm patterns across the horizon, or studying the way waves curled upon themselves before breaking. It was during these shared silences that their differences became clear. Kale saw the wind as sacred. He believed it carried wisdom, warnings, and comfort. He saw storms as teachings and gentle breezes as blessings. To him, the wind was a healer. Ilara saw the wind as a force that demanded caution. She felt its moods sharply, almost painfully. She respected it, but she feared its power. She had spent her life learning to stand against it, not lean into it. And yet, their different views didn't push them apart. Instead, they created a fragile balance that neither of them had known they needed. With Kale, Ilara learned to listen again, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. She began noticing the small details he pointed out, the way the air cooled before dawn, the way the clouds layered themselves before a mild wind, the quiet signals that meant the sea was shifting. She didn't fully trust the wind, but she trusted Kale, and that was enough to soften her heart. In return, Ilara taught Kale something he had never understood. She taught him that reverence without caution could be dangerous, that even sacred things could destroy. She showed him how storms could tear lives apart, and how the scars left behind could shape someone forever. Through her, Kale began to understand the weight of grief, and he admired her strength even more for carrying it. Their bond grew slowly, like a tide gaining strength with each passing hour. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It was something steady and deep, something that wrapped around Ilara like a warm current she didn't know she had needed. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt herself letting go of a small piece of Fae. Kale didn't erase her sorrow, but he helped her breathe through it. He made the wind seem less like a threat and more like a reminder that life could move forward. Ilara didn't realize how much she depended on him until long after they met. She didn't yet understand the way he was shaping her future, or how deeply he would anchor himself in her heart. But the wind knew, and it carried the sense of change like a promise waiting in the distance. The months after Kale arrived felt peaceful, almost gentle, as if the world itself approved of their growing bond. The winds softened around the village. Storms came later and left sooner. Even the sea seemed calmer, rolling with a slower rhythm. Ilara felt something inside her open during that time. She allowed herself to hope, even though she feared hope could be dangerous. But balance never lasts forever. The first sign of danger came in the form of a strange heaviness in the air. Ilara noticed it before anyone else. The breeze that usually brushed her face during morning chores felt heavy and uneasy, like a warning wrapped in silence. She felt the shifting pressure settle in her chest, making her heart beat faster. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a strong sense that something was coming. Kale felt it too. She saw it in the way he stood still on the cliffs, studying the horizon with a focused calm that only appeared when he sensed something serious. The travelers in his group began placing their hands on the ground, listening for movements beneath the earth. Some marked symbols in the sand. Others tied their banners tightly, their faces marked with worry. The villagers noticed the change soon after. The sky darkened far too quickly. The clouds stacked upon one another in sharp, unnatural layers. The air grew thick and warm, pressing against the skin like a fever. Animals grew restless. Birds hid. Even the ocean, which rarely quieted, seemed to hold its breath. Kale told the village that the coming storm carried a strange energy, nothing like the storms he had studied before. He believed it was tied to an imbalance, something deeper than weather patterns. Something old, something heavy with emotion. Ilara felt the truth in his words, even if she didn't understand them fully. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple before the first roll of thunder echoed across the cliffs. The storm built itself piece by piece, rising higher and darker until it towered over the sea like a living wall. Lightning flickered inside the clouds, trapped and desperate, as if the sky was choking on its own rage. Ilara's fear returned all at once. It slammed into her with the same force she had felt as a child the night her mother died. She felt the wind twist sharply around the houses, knocking over baskets and rattling roofs. Her body tensed with every gust. Her chest tightened with old memories. She felt the storm reaching for her, pulling her back into the past she never truly escaped. Kale, though shaken, understood something she did not. He could feel the storm building toward disaster. He believed the winds carried a warning, a call to protect the sailors who were still out at sea, unaware of the monstrous force rising behind them. The village depended on those fishermen, and their boats stood no chance against what was forming. Ilara saw him preparing to leave. She felt a deep panic rise inside her, sharp and overwhelming. She feared losing him the same way she had lost her mother, swallowed by a sky that cared nothing for the love she carried. But Kale had always lived by his principles. He believed the wind spoke for a reason. He believed that if he understood its warnings, he had a responsibility to act. Even as the storm thickened and the cliffs shook beneath their feet, he moved toward danger with a calm, determined grace. Ilara followed him to the edge of the village, her heart pounding. Memories of her mother's final moments crashed over her like violent waves. She felt powerless, small, and terrified. The wind howled around them, wild, angry, desperate. It carried dust, salt, and sharp fragments of fear. Kale went anyway. He stepped into the storm as lightning ripped across the sky. The wind lashed at him, trying to push him back or pull him deeper. Elara couldn't tell which. She watched him struggle through the growing chaos, his body swaying with each violent gust, until the storm swallowed him completely. Hours passed, though they felt like endless days. The storm raged with a fury no one had seen before. Buildings shook. Waves slammed into the cliffs with deafening force. Villages huddled together, praying the sky would show mercy. Elara stood outside, refusing to hide, even as rain and wind cut against her skin. She kept searching the darkness for any sign of Kale, but the storm did not give him back. When the winds finally tired and the clouds began to drift apart, Kale was gone. No footprints, no torn fabric, no broken tool, only silence and the distant roar of waves. Elara fell to the ground, shaken and hollow. The storm had taken her mother. Now it had taken the man who taught her how to breathe again. In that moment, she felt something inside her break, not with noise, but with a deep, painful quiet. She knew, in her heart, that the wind had taken what she loved most, and she did not know how to forgive it. After the storm swallowed Kale, the world around Elara felt empty in a way she had never experienced before. The village slowly returned to its routines, but Elara did not. She wandered through each day as if moving through thick fog. Every sound felt distant. Every color felt faded. The sea, once her anchor, now felt like an open wound. The cliffs became the only place where she could breathe, even if the air there hurt her. She went there every morning, standing at the edge where Kale had last been seen. She watched the waves crash below and searched the sky for answers she knew would never come. The villagers whispered about her. Some pitied her, some avoided her. Others blamed her grief for bringing the storm so close to home. In a place where people believed the wind carried emotions and warnings, they feared that her sorrow had called the storm into existence. Their whispers reached her ears even when their mouths stayed shut. She felt their stares like tiny cuts. She felt their fear like a weight pressing on her back. She did not blame them. In a way, she understood. The storm had taken Kale, and she had been the one closest to him. Her connection to the wind had always been strange. People had noticed it since she was a child. Now, they wondered if something dark inside her had fed the storm's strength. Elara tried to ignore their thoughts, but she couldn't ignore the voice inside her, whispering the same fears. She told herself Kale's death was an accident. She told herself the storm had been too powerful, too unnatural for anyone to survive. But deep down, she felt something sharper, the belief that the wind had taken him on purpose, just as it had taken her mother. This thought began to grow inside her. It grew slowly, like a seed fed by pain. Every day she stood on the cliffs, that seed pushed deeper into her heart. She felt the wind brush past her with an uneven, mocking movement. She felt it tug at her hair, her clothes, her memories. It felt cruel. It felt personal. One late afternoon, weeks after the storm, Elara stood at the cliff's edge again. The sky above her was a heavy gray, holding back another storm that never quite formed. The air felt tense, as if waiting for something. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe deeply, but the breath caught in her throat. She saw Kale in her mind, his steady gaze, his calm smile, his way of listening to the wind as if it were a friend. The memory broke her. Her knees weakened. Her hands shook. She fell to the ground as waves of grief forced their way through her chest. She pressed her palms into the date, feeling it crumble beneath her fingers. She felt her heartbeat pounding through her whole body, wild and out of rhythm. The wind around her picked up slightly, swaying just enough to sting her skin. And in that moment, it felt like the wind was laughing. Something inside her snapped. All the sorrow she had held in for years surged upward. Her mother's death, Kale's loss, her fear, her loneliness, the weight of being wind-marked, the accusations, the memories. Everything she had locked away burst free like a flood breaking through a dam. She lifted her face to the sky, her eyes burning with tears, and she let out a cry so full of pain it shook her entire body. It wasn't a planned curse. It wasn't a thoughtful act. It was raw emotion, torn from the deepest part of her. It was a plea, a scream, a demand. It was everything she had never said to the wind, the hatred, the blame, the exhaustion. She wanted the wind to feel what she felt. She wanted it to stop hurting her. She wanted it to stop taking. She wanted it to stop. The moment the emotion left her body, the world reacted. The wind stopped. Not gradually, not gently. It stopped instantly, as if someone had cut a string holding the sky in place. The air froze against her skin. The breeze that had carried her hair back moments before dropped completely. The waves below slowed, their edges softening unnaturally. Even the sound of the sea faded, like someone lowering the volume of the world. Elara lifted her head, confused. She felt the silence deep inside her bones. The flags in the village behind her drooped, lifeless. Birds that had been circling above suddenly faltered and landed, unable to glide without the air's support. Smoke from distant cooking fires rose straight upward in a thin, rigid line. The clouds overhead, dark and heavy, paused mid-swirl, their movement frozen like paint on a canvas. A cold stillness wrapped around her. It was not peaceful. It was hollow, sharp, terrifying. She felt her heart race as a terrible realization formed in her mind, slow and heavy like a stone sinking into water. Her grief had reached the wind. Her rage had touched the sky. Her pain had changed something that was never meant to change. She had cursed the wind, and the wind had listened. Elara stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. She looked around, hoping for a breeze, a ripple of air, a single sign that the world was still breathing. But nothing moved. Not a leaf, not a wave, not even the smallest grain of dust. The world had gone silent, and she understood, with a deep, overwhelming dread, that she had done something irreversible. This was not the end of her grief. It was the beginning of a much larger suffering, one that would reach far beyond her own heart. When the wind fell silent, the world began to notice immediately. At first, it was small things, flags hanging motionless, sails drooping on empty masts, smoke from fires standing straight in the air like frozen towers. But soon, the consequences spread like ripple from a stone thrown into still water. Crops that had always relied on the wind for pollination began to wither. Fields of wheat stood tall and golden, but the grains never moved, never shook free, and never matured properly. Orchards produced fruit unevenly, small and bitter. Farmers wandered their land with empty hands and worried hearts, unsure how to coax life from soil that refused to breathe. Temperature swings became extreme. Without air circulation, heat baked the land during the day and cold gripped it at night. People shivered under blankets during summer, while fires burned low, unable to carry warmth through the stagnant air. Even animals struggled to adapt. Birds fell silent and restless, unable to soar. Bees, once tireless workers, died quietly in the hives. Insects and small creatures vanished or starved, leaving forests and fields strangely still. The sea, too, felt the change. Without wind to push the waves, tides stagnated. Ships could no longer navigate. Fishing communities struggled. Trade slowed, then stopped. Merchants grew anxious. Harbors filled with vessels at anchor, sails drooping like forgotten dreams. A strange quiet settled over the waves, heavy and unnatural, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. Kale's people, the wind readers, were most deeply affected. Their rituals relied on air in motion, the whispers of currents, the patterns of storms, the signs carried from distant lands. Without the wind, their traditions became hollow. They tried to interpret silence as a message, but the silence was absolute. Their guides, who had once read the language of air, now sat in despair, their hands empty, their chants unanswered. All over the world, humans and nature alike began to feel the emptiness of still air. Villagers whispered Alara's name, half in fear, half in awe. Some called her a prophet, Others called her a destroyer. Rumors traveled faster than the still winds. Travelers who ventured into the region returned with stories of a woman who had cursed the air. Her grief, her rage, her heartbreak, they said, had become stronger than the storms themselves. Ilara herself withdrew completely. She left her home and wandered the cliffs where Kale had been lost. She no longer tried to sleep, no longer cooked, no longer smiled. She barely spoke to anyone. Her mind churned with guilt so heavy it pressed against her chest and made every breath feel like sand. She could feel the world around her responding to her grief. The air that once carried sound, scent, and life had become a mirror of her heart, stopped, silent, and empty. The villagers avoided her. Even the people who had once shown curiosity now kept their distance. But some dared to leave offerings at the cliff's edge, small gifts of flowers, cloth, or shells, as if trying to calm a storm that no one else could see. Yet none of it mattered. The wind did not return. The world did not forgive. Only the woman remained, a single figure against a frozen horizon. And everywhere Ilara looked, she saw the consequences of her grief. Rivers that once flowed with a lively ripple now crept along like thick syrup. Trees stood tall but unmoving, their leaves unmurmuring. Fires refused to spread without a breath to carry their flame. Even the sun felt oppressive, its heat unbroken by the usual cooling gusts. She realized, with horror, that this was not punishment. It was the world reflecting back the emptiness she carried inside herself. She understood, fully, that she had done far more than curse the wind. She had altered life itself. She had taken from every living thing a rhythm they could not live without. She had become both the cause of suffering and the witness to it. And in the deepest part of her heart, she knew she could not undo this with words alone. She had to face her own grief fully, or the silence would remain. Ilara sank to the cliffside, her face buried in her hands. Around her, the world waited, frozen. The wind had died, and the weight of its absence pressed down on every soul, every tree, every wave. For the first time, she realized that her sorrow was no longer private. It had become a force, one that could undo everything she had ever loved. The world had gone still, and Ilara, though broken, began to understand that if she hoped for any chance at redemption, she would have to move through the grief that had become stronger than life itself. The world remained quiet, not peaceful, but hollow, an absence so deep it felt alive. Ilara walked through the villages and fields, through forests and along coasts where the wind once danced. She could hear nothing. She could feel nothing but the heavy stillness pressing down on her chest. Every step she took seemed amplified by silence, each footfall echoing in a world that no longer breathed. People avoided her. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Warnings, accusations, even prayers disguised as offerings. Some called her a destroyer, a woman who had brought life to a standstill. Others said she had become the guardian of a lesson, though none could say what the lesson was. Their fear and awe weighed on her, but it could not compare to the weight she carried herself. The memory of Kale, the loss of her mother, the emptiness of the windless world. Eventually, Ilara left her village altogether. She traveled toward distant lands where Kale's people had once journeyed with the wind. She followed trails that had become empty and silent, guided not by maps or words, but by the faint memory of the currents he once read. Each step was laborious. Each day stretched like an endless tide. She felt the eyes of the world upon her, though none followed. When she arrived, she found them struggling. Kale's people, once so attuned to the whispers of air, now moved through their rituals mechanically. They marked patterns in the sand that would never ripple. They held instruments that would never sing. They chanted prayers into silence. Their eyes were hollow, their hands empty, and their hearts heavy. They looked at her with confusion, suspicion, and grief, a reflection of the world itself. Ilara knelt before them, and for the first time in months, she spoke the truth in her own way. Not in words, but in presence. She carried the weight of her grief openly. She allowed them to see that she knew what she had done. The air around them did not shift, but stillness became something more, a quiet confession that stretched from her chest to the cliffs, to the seas, to the horizon itself. Some reacted with fury, some with despair, some could only stare, unable to process what had occurred. But a few, the elders, saw the depth of her loss and the enormity of her responsibility. One elder, an old wind priest who had once guided Kale, stepped forward. She did not speak immediately. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the air, which offered nothing, but to the presence of Alara's grief. At last, the elder spoke. Her voice was calm, deep, and reverent. She explained that the wind had disappeared because the world had mirrored the human heart. It did not respond to anger or fear alone. It had responded to absolute grief, to a sorrow so pure that it became stronger than the currents themselves. Alara's pain had rippled through the world, and the world had paused to bear it. This knowledge hit her like a wave. She understood, finally, that the wind was not gone because it hated her. It was gone because her grief had been a storm no one could survive. She realized that to bring it back, she could not fight it with anger or desire. She had to confront herself fully. She had to move through the sorrow, not away from it. The elder guided her, not with rituals or magic, but with a quiet understanding that the world's breath was tied to the human heart. Alara began small, standing still, noticing the faintest changes in the sky, listening to sounds she had ignored. She began to honor her pain rather than push it away. Each day, she carried it more openly, allowing it to fill her without spilling over. She discovered that stillness could be a path, not a prison. By facing her grief, by acknowledging her mistakes and her losses, she began to feel a faint stirring around her, a subtle tremor in the trees, a soft sigh from the sea, a hint that life itself was waiting for her to let go, if only just enough to begin again. For the first time in months, Alara felt a fragile thread of hope. It was not strong, and it was not certain, but it was something she had not felt since the storm had taken Kale. And she knew, deep in her heart, that redemption would require patience, courage, and the willingness to feel everything she had tried to escape. The path forward was not clear. The wind had not returned. The world remained still. But Alara had begun the first step toward change. She was listening, and she was willing to learn how to let the world breathe again. Alara returned to the cliffs where she had lost Kale. The windless world stretched before her, silent and heavy. The stillness no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a mirror. Every frozen wave, every unmoving leaf, every stagnant cloud reflected the emptiness she carried inside herself. She realized that to restore the wind, she could not only act on the world. She had to act on herself. She began a journey inward, not across lands, but through memory and grief. She sat for hours, recalling the night her mother had died. She remembered the fear, the helplessness, the violent gusts that tore her family apart. She let herself feel the sharp, bitter sorrow she had buried under years of survival and routine. The memory no longer shocked her. It no longer made her small. She faced it fully, letting it rise, settle, and pass through her. Then she thought of Kale, the quiet man who had taught her to see beauty in storms, who had brought balance to her grief. She recalled his steady gaze, his gentle patience, his calm in the face of fear, and she allowed herself to feel the loss again, not as a wound to close, but as a river flowing through her. She understood that her love for him had not vanished with the storm. It remained alive inside her, fragile but undeniable. Alara realized the truth that had always eluded her. The curse she had cast was not truly on the wind. It had been on the cycle of change itself. She had sought to stop life from moving, from taking away those she loved. The stillness of the world was a reflection of her denial, her refusal to accept loss as part of existence. She had tried to control what was uncontrollable, and the result was devastation. Sitting in the silent cliffs, she began to confront her own bitterness. She recognized how it had shaped her every thought and every fear. She forgave herself, not completely, not easily, but enough to begin understanding the balance she had upset. She forgave the wind, not because it had been merciful, but because it had been the mirror of her heart. As she moved through each memory, each pang of grief, she felt something subtle shift within her. It was as though a tiny stir of air was moving along the edges of her awareness, barely noticeable, but real. She understood that the wind did not return because she demanded it, but because she was finally willing to feel the sorrow she had tried to bury. Her journey inward was neither mystical nor sudden. It was patient, slow, and demanding. She revisited every moment she had tried to escape: fear, love, loss, anger, and regret. She allowed herself to cry for the mother she had lost and the man she could not save. She allowed herself to remember the small joys, the laughter, and the warmth that had once filled her life. And in that stillness, Ilara realized the ultimate lesson. Love and grief were inseparable. Denying one destroyed the balance of the world, and accepting both allowed life to flow forward. She did not seek to erase her pain, but to carry it, fully and consciously, so that it no longer trapped the wind or the world. The cliffs remained silent around her, but within her, the first whisper of movement began, soft, gentle, almost imperceptible. It was the beginning of the wind's return, but only because she had begun to restore the balance within herself. Ilara returned to the cliff where she had unleashed the curse. The place felt sacred now, heavy with memory, grief, and the weight of what she had done. She looked out over the silent sea and the still fields below, feeling the enormity of the emptiness she had caused. This was a moment she had been preparing for, not with spells or chants, but with the quiet acceptance of her own heart. She stood at the edge, letting the cliffs press against her feet, the frozen air brushing her face. She did not call to the wind. She did not demand its return. She simply allowed herself to feel every loss, every fear, every pang of love she had carried through the years. She let the memory of Kale fill her chest without suffocating her, the memory of her mother without despair, and her own mistakes without shame. And then, very slowly, she exhaled. It was a small movement at first, a whisper of air that shifted against her cheek, so slight she almost doubted it. She waited, holding herself still, and felt it again. A faint current moved along the cliffs, carrying with it a gentle rustle of leaves. Not a storm, not a gale, just a breath, quiet and hesitant, but undeniably there. The cliffs, the trees, the sea, they began to respond. Flags lifted slightly on their poles. The waves rippled across the ocean's surface, moving in small, circular patterns. Birds stretched their wings and hopped along the ground, testing their strength. Even the smoke from distant fires began to drift, curling softly as if learning to move again. Ilara felt tears run down her face. Relief mingled with sorrow. She did not leap in joy. She did not shout in triumph. She simply allowed herself to feel the weight of what had happened and what was beginning to heal. The wind returned not in celebration, but in quiet acknowledgement of balance restored. It would not be a perfect restoration. The world had been changed by her grief, by the stillness that had lasted too long. Crops would take time to recover. Forests would need the bees and birds to return. People would have to relearn how to live with the wind again. But Ilara understood now that the wind did not need to be perfect. It only needed to move. And to move, the world needed her to accept her pain fully, without trying to erase it. She fell to her knees on the cliffs, overwhelmed by the slow, trembling return of life. The wind brushed her hair, whispered against her cheek, and carried the faintest memory of Kale's voice. She let herself collapse into the moment, not in celebration, but in gratitude for the chance to carry forward, knowing the world could breathe again, even if imperfectly. The wind was no longer her enemy. It was a companion, fragile and tentative, but alive. And in that fragile breath, Ilara felt the cost of her actions, the heartbreak, the loss, the years of guilt, but also the quiet hope that life could continue, guided by love rather than fear. She would never forget what had happened, nor Kale, nor her mother. But the wind now moved again, not because she demanded it, but because she had finally learned to move with it. The cliffs, the sea, the fields, all of it began to breathe once more. And Ilara, at last, felt herself breathing with them. Years passed, and the world slowly recovered. The wind returned in gentle currents at first, then in the steady rhythms that once carried life and stories across lands. Fields bloomed, rivers rippled, forests whispered again, and oceans moved with a familiar pulse. Birds returned to the skies, insects resumed their work, and sailors once more trusted their sails to the breath of the air. The cultures that had long depended on wind adapted. They rebuilt rituals, relearned the patterns of storms, and celebrated the small movements in the air that had once been so easily taken for granted. Stories of the woman who had cursed the wind traveled far, told in hushed tones around fires and in markets, in schools and temples. She was neither saint nor villain, only human, burdened by grief and capable of love, capable of mistakes, and capable of redemption. Ilara lived quietly in the years that followed, carrying the memory of Kale in her heart. She tended the cliffs where the wind first returned, walking among the fields and forests with gentle awareness. She no longer sought to control the air or the world. Instead, she listened. She felt the rise and fall of the wind as a companion, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been regained. And she knew the truth. The wind does not forget. It carries memory, the pain of loss, the warmth of love, the ache of grief, and the hope that endures even after silence. It moves not for power, not for fear, but because life insists on continuing. Ilara closed her eyes and let the wind brush her face. It whispered across the cliffs, across the fields, across the oceans, softly, endlessly, carrying the weight of all that had been and all that could still be. The world breathed again, and so did she.